part of the process moving forward. I've not heard from anybody specifically about hearings, but I'm sure the issue will, as you and I both know, will come up in the veto session in the spring session, and that's fine. And having a conversation about this is an important thing to do. I certainly don't want to, diminish any of that and say that it's not an important issue for us to discuss, because I think it is. With that said, I hate for the situation to be politicized. And that's what I feel like some of this is occurring now. And I think that, again, let's focus on how we can make things better for everybody.
That's Illinois Sheriff's Association Executive Director Jim Kaitschuk in a conversation I had with him yesterday in the aftermath of what kinds of reforms could be possible after the Sonya Massey shooting last month when it comes to police employment scrutiny and screenings. Welcome in Illinois in Focus Daily. I'm Greg Bishop. Thanks for being part of the program each and every weekday morning with Illinois in Focus Daily. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and join us as we get you what you need to know to start your day. And this has been an ongoing story really since July 6th here in Springfield. Sonya Massey called about a suspected prowler in the early morning hours, and sheriff's deputies arrived to respond, go into the home, and ultimately the situation ended up with one of the sheriff's deputies shooting and killing Sonya Massey. And obviously that sheriff's deputy was fired and charged with murder. But since then, there's been ongoing questions about what kinds of reforms there could be. Governor J.B. Pritzker has been asked about this all week at different unrelated events. Even yesterday, after cutting the ribbon at the Illinois State Fair, he was asked about what kinds of reforms there could be in the aftermath of all of this.
There's so much more to do. And I met with the Massey family, so did the Lieutenant Governor. We listened to what they had to say about what ought to happen. I've certainly heard what some legislators think, and there are ideas that are floating around. I don't think there's a bill that anybody's put together. It's hard to tell exactly what could be done, especially when there isn't transparency in the sheriff's department about how this person was hired after the sheriff's deputy resigned over and over again, couldn't hold a job at a department, a law enforcement department. And then I just want to add at the end, let's all acknowledge that the vast majority of our law enforcement officers do the right thing. And we ought to praise them for that. And then when someone doesn't do the right thing, we need to hold them accountable. And that is what is happening right now with Sonya Massey's killing. So I want to praise the state's attorney. I want to praise the ISP and everybody who's been involved, even in the peaceful protests, who have tried to call attention to this matter to make sure that people here in the state of Illinois, all across the state, as well as around the country, pay attention to this so that it doesn't happen again here or anywhere. And
there is a lot of attention on this. Again, President Joe Biden has been asked about this, and he's commented on it. You had former President Donald Trump asked about it, and he's commented on it. So it's obviously raised awareness about the issues. But what are the issues? Obviously, this sheriff's deputy, Sean Grayson, had a checkered employment history, and there's questions that Governor Pritzker says that Sangamon County Sheriff Jack Campbell has not answered, and he's been saying all week that Campbell needs to resign. Calls that Campbell's refused to accept, saying that he's working to find the best ways to make sure that bad actors don't get into policing. But here's more from Governor J.B. Pritzker yesterday.
Well, we don't know all the circumstances about why Sean Grayson was hired. And this is one of the most frustrating things about the situation now. The sheriff could have made this more transparent, has refused to do so. Why was Sean Grayson hired? Nobody can answer that question except the sheriff and his HR folks. We ought to see them talk to us about it. Meanwhile, the shortage of labor is not limited to police. It's in fact in every industry. We've seen it. It's getting better. And in fact, we've had more and more people working in the state of Illinois. The recovery has been terrific from the nadir of the COVID-19 pandemic recession. And so we've seen more and more people applying. There are more applications and more opportunities to be hired. But only people who meet the qualifications should be hired, and they should be screened. References should be made. That's how it should be done.
So what does that process look like? I talked with Jim Kaitschuk. He is the executive director of the Illinois Sheriff's Association. And yesterday he laid out in detail the general line of how somebody gets into law enforcement in particular to work for a sheriff's office. And there are a lot of hoops that people have to jump through.
Well, I mean, you're going to have there's certainly there are minimum qualifications that any officer in the state of Illinois has to have, and those are set by statute. So you have to be, for example, 21 years of age. You have to not be convicted of a felony. You have to be eligible to be able to receive a FOID card, things like that. That's kind of the basic parameters for application. From that point in time, counties over 1 million people in population have to have what's called, for sheriff's offices, they have to have what's called a Sheriff's Merit Commission. Other counties in the state that are below 1 million can have them, but they're not required to by law. Although a lot of them do set them up, and they set them up by ordinance through their county boards. Sangamon County, for example, would have a merit commission. So from that point in time, there's variance, Greg, from location to location about how the hiring process works. But generally speaking, many of them will have you apply their application, they'll evaluate the application, see if you're eligible to, in a lot of cases, there will be a written test that they have to pass. There will be a physical test called the power test that they have to pass. From that point in time, many will also then go through a psychological exam that they're evaluated on to see if they're an eligible candidate to be able to handle being in law enforcement. Some may also go through either in addition to or alternatively, they may take a polygraph. From that point in time, if they pass all those stages, then they would be considered eligible to be hired by that agency. From that point in time, and the Merit Commission would approve that eligibility list, indicating that they passed those different components and that they were up for consideration at that point in time for potential hire. Then the sheriff's office would make a decision about who they want to hire. From that point in time, they would then enroll in the Basic Law Enforcement Academy, and there are several academies across the state. And they would submit that information and that request to the Illinois Law Enforcement Trainings and Standards Board to make sure that that person had, an appropriate background check. They checked their background as well as the agency that was hiring them. And from that point in time, they enroll in the academy, and now the academy is 16 weeks. They have to, if they don't pass the academy, obviously they're out. At the end of the academy, they then have a state exam that they have to take. That they have to pass a minimum of 70%. From there, then they go through what's called a field training process within the agency that they're hired. That could be a lot of in classroom when they make it to the new agency. It also is obviously going to be hands-on field experience from there. And then when they're completed with that, then they're released to go work as a deputy.
So clearly, a lot of hoops that have to be jumped through in order for somebody to even be hired. They have to pass all these exams and then go through a merit commission that gives the green light, and then references and such can be checked. But the governor yesterday again was talking a lot about the hiring process and was critical of it, though he said that he wasn't sure of what kinds of reform statewide there could be.
Remember that it's near impossible when you say someone resigned from a position, right? It's near impossible to make a judgment unless there's more of a report that's been, as you say, has been passed from one department to another. But there's a lot of protecting people. What happens is they do something wrong in a department, and the department head, the HR department, decides, well, they don't want to affect this person's career going forward. So instead of holding them accountable at that department and having a record of that, they'll just quietly recommend that they resign. And that is how you see somebody moving from position to position. Now, should they do more? Absolutely. Those local departments should be held accountable if there was wrongdoing at the department that went unreported, and instead the person was suggested to simply resign. But again, these are questions that a sheriff who's hiring somebody ought to be asking. I don't know whether he asked those questions. It seems to me he could not have. If he had, he would have learned a lot. Someone who moves from job to job, 1 year, half a year, and does it 6 times over the course of a few years, and whose record coming out of the military is questionable, I think those are all things that ought to be taken into account. And I want to know, and all of us, I think, want to know why the sheriff didn't take those things into account or dive deeper into those questions. It seems like there were cursory conversations because a resignation, well, that seems benign.
So having posed that situation to Jim Kaitschuk, the executive director of the Illinois Sheriff's Association, he said that there could be some possible fixes here with the overall vetting process.
Well, I think I think that, yes, I think there are some things that probably certainly, I mean, we're going to evaluate all of this, Greg. Do I have an answer for you specifically as to what could or should be changed yet? No, but we're going to go through a process to try to, examine that thoroughly and make sure that we can make changes that are going to be helpful to the profession and bring more good people back in. With that said, in terms of this individual, yes, three of the agencies that he was hired at were all part-time. So I think you got to take into consideration a part-time person may work at two or three different jurisdictions at the same time. And I'm not picking specifically on him, but obviously if that's a part-time gig, maybe they have to do that because they're not hired full-time anywhere else for a different profession or whatever. So they may just be doing that to make ends meet. And I think you look for at that point in time, opportunities on a full-time basis where, a lot of the motivation is, I'd like to continue to quote unquote move up, right? I'd like to go to a bigger agency each time I go to something where I think I've got more opportunities. And that's generally, a path of, law enforcement as a whole. If I'm an officer, those are the kind of things that I'm seeking to be able to do for myself. In this particular case, I can't speak to all of the details behind the scene because I don't know them. I know what I've read, but I can tell you that the information behind there, in terms of providing information, maybe there's a process where we have to, there has to be a release of information provided by that individual, the applicant that says, hey, give all my information out. And then the agency that has the information, make sure that they make the request that's required. I think there's some things that could be looked at there. But again,
and this is all something that could be discussed in the months ahead leading into the fall veto session and even early next year with spring session. But what about those calls for Jack Campbell, the Sangamon County Sheriff, to resign? Executive Director of the Illinois Sheriff's Association, Jim Kaitschuk, reacting to that.
First of all, the sheriff is elected, right? I mean, there's a process to go through. They're not appointed. They are elected. And unfortunately, sometimes people have employees that do bad things. Under those circumstances, should the person that is overseeing those employees, if they're the head of the agency, should they be forced to resign in all those circumstances? That's probably not an appropriate thing. I support Sheriff Campbell. I mean, I think Sheriff Campbell, if you know him, he is a sincere, quality individual. And I can tell you that unequivocally, that this situation is not something that he is taking lightly by any stretch of the imagination. And he wants to make things better and make things right. And I think he deserves an opportunity to stay in that office to be able to do so. So from my perspective, let's look at what we can do to build better moving forward, as opposed to sitting here and continuing to talk about, what happened in the past. I certainly don't want to diminish again, the death of Sonya Massey, because it was horrible. It is horrible, and I feel horrible for the family and all those involved. But at the same time, I think that, it's an incident that has occurred, and we need to be able to, take that incident and figure out, what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and let's try to not have those things happen again in the future. And I think Sheriff Campbell, nobody's going to be closer to the situation than he is. And if we're going to make improvements, he's the guy to be able to help us get there.
So fascinating conversation. Obviously, we'll follow up on all of that and more. It is Illinois in Focus Daily. I'm Greg Bishop. Thanks for being here each and every weekday morning. Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for Illinois in Focus Daily.